Yeah, but here you woke up, I'm so sorry. Here, what do you do? What do you do? No, it's very clear. Because I was sort of in my church. So, when I was told everybody the story, Richard told this when I told him when I was 10 years old.
I don't agree that it's but George is still...
Before I introduce this speaker, I wanted to say something about today's program generally. This was to be a bridging event so the people who were attending the academic conference could get something that was more from the Georgists, and also the people who were in the Georgist part could get something that would set the context for the academic discussions. And I thought there must be something in Scranton that had some Georgist connections somewhere, and I had no idea what, except that I'd heard about the Mcguires, which was south of here, but in this anthracite region. And I thought that controversy might be a connection, but I drove up here last summer and went about looking for connections, and oh my goodness, what connections there are. Some of you know that Terence Powderly was Georgia's biggest ally in labor, at least early on, before they their differences on the free trade issue got to predominate their relationship. What most of you don't know, and I didn't know, was that Terence Powderly had been the mayor of Scranton prior to getting involved with Henry George for 3 terms. That he won against he won on the Labor Party ticket, the Greenback Labor Party ticket. The other big issue of the progressive movement was, besides land value tax, was greenback dollars. And he won against the Democrats and Republicans decided to both back the same guy. And he still won. And he still won. Well, it was formerly a coalition ticket. There was only one candidate, and he was one other candidate. He was the Democratic Republican candidate. So that was one major connection. Then there was connections between Powderly and the Mcguires. The story I had heard, that I think, because I heard it in the milieu of Georgists talking to another, the story I had heard was that the Knights of Labor was a small struggling organization, and then they got hooked up with Henry George, and wow, they went from 60,000 to 700,000, and so we went, it turns out that the Knights of Labor was a secret Masonic organization. Well, it was a secret organization started by Masons, and it had all the trappings of Masonry in it. And when the Mcguire violence when the Mcguires were accused of all this violence, the Knights of Labor was accused of being a front group for the Mcguires, and the Catholic Church condemned secret organizations generally, but it had already condemned the Masons very explicitly. In fact, in 1972, when I got married to my first wife in the Catholic Church, they had a screening process, and they asked me in a much gentler tone than Joseph McCarthy would have asked. They asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Masons? And I said, what's a Mason? And they said, well, it's an organization that we're not comfortable with. And I said, well, if I had been a member, then what? And then they said, then we would have asked more questions. So that has a lot to do with it. Then I found out, largely from Maria Mazzenga over here, that Terence Powderly had himself been attacked by the Catholic Church. The Knights of Labor was condemned in Canada. A Catholic was not allowed. Of course, church enforcement is mostly moral sanction. But a Catholic member was not allowed to belong to the Knights of Labor in Canada, and there was a big move to get Powderly sanctioned and the Knights of Labor condemned in the United States. And that this move, all this preceded Henry George's involvement. And then the next parallel was that the Catholic Church was divided into this, there was this big split in the Catholic Church. The conservative Catholics who wanted to keep things the way they had always done it in Europe, tended to ally themselves in Europe with the aristocracy, which was Catholic. And over here, when they allied themselves with the same principles that would put them with the aristocracy, they had a problem because the aristocracy was Protestant, and the working people who were agitating against the aristocracy were Catholic, almost entirely. And so the Catholic Church was in a bind, and the liberal Catholics' point of view, which Maria will get with far more precision, was that if you're going to side with the Protestant aristocracy over your Catholic constituency, we might as well just go back to Europe. So all that had gone on before Henry George. There's, what I had always heard among the Georgists was that Rerum Novarum was about Henry George, and that Archbishop Corrigan went after Father McGlynn, and the church, all this was because of Henry George. But I'm beginning to sense that the hostility to Henry George was that he was seen as a fellow traveler of Terence Powderly. So this whole thing is much more complicated than I ever thought. And what's fascinating to me is that here's a chance for us, we who study Georgist theory, a chance for us to see what the environment was in which he was speaking, what was really going on, that he was not a crusader championing things in a vacuum, that he was part of a great struggle that began before he got there, and that he became a major player in. Later this morning, we have some things about the fire down below, which is a great coal strike that started in this region. And the statue of John Mitchell outside, he was the founding head of the United Mine Workers. And as I look through the history of that, I see that just as the Georgists forgot who came before them, of course, so did the later people forget about Henry George. And we were always miffed about that, but we're guilty of it too. And so pulling all these contexts together has real value in that when we start acknowledging the shoulders upon whom Henry George stood, we now then require the moral authority to start asking the people who revere the later heroes to acknowledge the soldiers upon whom they stood. So this, I think, might help get us out of a vacuum in that regard. So I think that's enough. I think Maria knows so much more in great detail about Terence Powderly and even about Powderly's connections with George, although she kind of recently researched that, because I knew about Powderly and George, but I didn't know about Powderly. So this is Maria Mazzenga. She is the curator she is the Education Outreach Director for Catholic University of America's library system. And Catholic University of America has the definitive collection of things related to Terence Powderly. So she drew on a tremendous wealth of information and seemed very knowledgeable, and in talking to her, it's just the give and take was wonderful, and I think we have an opportunity to do some further things. I'm putting at least least one of Terence Powderly's books on the web. If you go to savingcommunities.org and click Document Library and find powderly.terence, right now his position on the Molly Mcguires is on the web, and he has a long passage on land railroads and telegraphy that will soon be on the web, and he has a shorter passage on money, and that will soon be on the web, and they were all very compatible with what Henry George wrote. And even free trade, Powderly's position was, Henry George says that if we abolished land monopoly, free trade would work just fine. And so Powderly's position was, well then shut up about free trade, abolish land monopoly, and we will all see the wisdom of what you had said, and we will support free trade. And I tend to agree that George got off on that free trade tangent to his detriment. He lost the support of labor, and he lost his message. He had a core message, and he diverted from it, and it cost him politically. So, Maria Mazzenga.
And I would hasten to add that I am not an expert on Henry George. I know some things about Powderly and the Catholic Church in the late 19th century. I am a historian. I have my doctoral degree from Catholic University, so I do know about the church and American history generally, but you guys can enlighten me on Henry George. So jump in whenever you see an opportunity to.
Oh, you asked for it.
And, I'm also amazed at your powers of retention from conversations we've had over the phone about this a lot of what we've been talking about, Powderly and George. Two things I wanted to start with. I love this cartoon. I don't know how closely you guys can see this. Anyone ever hear of Puck? Magazine? Okay, you know Puck. Puck is a famous magazine of the late 19th century. They did these really magnificent cartoons. And I like this particular cartoon for this particular conversation. Please jump in whenever you feel like it. I mean, if I don't finish my talk, if we had a good conversation, it doesn't matter.
Can you tell us what those little words are?
Yes, I'm going to tell you. First of all, it says benefit concert for the improvement of the laborer's condition, which most of you can see. The bottom says wanted a leader, the labor agitation orchestra on the go as you please plan. So it's making fun of the labor movement. But what's really interesting is when you look at the different figures. This is Edward Mcglynn. This is Terence Powderly. This is Henry George, and if you can see this, it says George's bass, as in the bass cello, the baseless theories. Baseless theories, as if, you know. Let's see. The drum is, that to me, there's no label on that one. But, I mean, what would you guess it would be?
Probably a socialist, because George was always jabbing into the socialists.
Okay. Or it could be just like a crazy laborer that's being pulled in many different directions.
Possibly that, you know, like the expression following the drum, beating the drum.
Right.
And that he was puncturing the drum.
But I like this guy in the middle too, is like, he's maybe like the aristocratic presence or the Protestant presence, like, oh my gosh, please stop talking. And then there's a couple that I can't completely see. This is American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers. That's Gompers up here. The symbols.
He's very symbol-minded.
And then that one, the last one I wrote down too, that was, Anarchist Press and Walking Delegate. So this is one of them is the Anarchist Press.
Up on the left.
The trombone is the Anarchist Press, yeah. So I love this. It's so rich and it's so illustrative of late 19th century dominant Protestant views of what was going on as far as labor. What's that?
What's the musical score? Can you read it? I can't.
It doesn't have any words or...
Gibberish.
Yeah, it looks like just scribbling, which would make sense because they're not really playing any consistent tune.
What is written on the flute?
That is... Actually, that one I can't read.
Is that Father Curran, or is that John Mitchell? Now, John Mitchell was later.
And it looks like a priest.
Which is bad and hard. Something about me.
That one I can't read. The flute I can't read. The harp, Powderly's something. It's hard. I got this from the internet, so I couldn't read it. You'd have to go and actually get Puck and actually look real closely at the words. But I think the cartoon is great for showing like ferment, of ideas going on in the late 19th century. So that's one thing that I would point to. The fact that there was all of this chaotic theory flying around, and Protestants hated it. They thought all of these people were bringing anarchy into the country, of course. The second thing I would point out, before I start talking about Powderly, Gibbons, McGlynn, and George, because their fates were very much interconnected and convoluted, is that in Italy in 1870, the church, the Italian state was unifying. Most of you probably know something about that. Italy was unifying, and papal lands were taken away, right, from the Vatican. The Vatican had controlled a lot of territory in Italy. And you may think this has nothing to do with the U.S., but it does, because the papacy felt beleaguered. They felt their territories were being taken away, and as a result, they tended to turn inward. So a lot of the people that were training for the priesthood, involved in the church at the time, began focusing on ecclesiastical power struggles and conversations within the church. And a lot of, we don't want to look bad to the outside, but we're going to struggle a lot within the church. And the convoluted nature of what happens in the labor movement in the United States and relations with George, Powderly, McGlynn, etc., is tied to that sort of fear of what outsiders think and this turning inward, this kind of grab for power that you see at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, who I'm going to be talking about today. 3 people, Terence Powderly, Cardinal James Gibbons, Father Edward McGlynn, and how they tie up with George. And just jump in and stop me if you have any questions or want to take it into a different level of discussion. Okay. Okay, now when I say 3 Catholics, Powderly, Gibbons, and McGlynn, I mean different kinds of Catholics. Now Powderly was a Catholic, but he was more of a nominal Catholic. He was very disenchanted with the Catholic Church by the end of his life. And if you look at his autobiography, it's called The Path I Trod. Is that the one you're trying to put online? Or are you putting
No, under 30 years first.
You know that's up.
Because I don't have...
It's in Google Books. Just FYI.
It's still easier to do it off a book.
Sure, absolutely. But you can also get it from Google Books. So if you look at his autobiography, he says, the church is a great institution. It does many good things. It has wonderful traditions. But many of its practitioners are evil. And there was lots of support for that in the late 19th century. So he was very critical of the church. And the other thing with Powderly is he was critical of the church, but he played a huge role in reconciling the Knights of Labor with the Catholic Church in the late 19th century. And you could have had a European situation, possibly in the late 19th century, where all the workers exit the church because the church is unsympathetic. That's what happened in Europe. In the U.S., if it weren't for someone like Terence Powderly and Cardinal Gibbons, okay? So he's a nominal Catholic, but he does respect the church's role and the church's role to influence labor. Second, Cardinal Gibbons. Cardinal James Gibbons was emphatically Catholic. He was the head of the American church in the late 19th century. Yeah, he's later on. But I'm just giving you an overview, and then I'm going to go on.
I just thought he had his picture in mind.
I do have his picture, but here. There he is. He was very Catholic, of course. He was a cardinal after 1886. He was the head of the most influential archdiocese in the country. He was the father of the American church in the late 19th century. He was the head of the Baltimore archdiocese. So he was also very influential. Sympathetic to labor, the most sympathetic clergyman in the U.S. to labor, or prelate, I guess I'd put it that way. And he would play a key role in reconciling the Knights of Labor and the Catholic Church. And then finally we have our last actor here, Father Edward McGlynn, which probably for you guys needs little introduction. Has a rocky relationship with the Catholic Church, is an avid Catholic at first, gets far into social theory and into Georgist theories, gets in trouble, is excommunicated, and then is reinstated by the late 19th century. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But these are the 3 individuals. I didn't know how much you knew about their background, so I wanted to give you a brief introduction to them. Now, to start with Powderly, the person we have, yes?
What about the Knights of Columbus in this? Is that a timeline?
Knights of Columbus are a Catholic organization as opposed to a labor organization. They were more of a fraternal Catholic organization, and they had ties perhaps with members of the Knights of Labor. But I would say Knights of Columbus were much more of a working class Catholic, or a middle class Catholic organization, less tied to the labor movement of the time.
I've heard from a very unreliable source, I don't remember who it was, that the Knights of Columbus was started by people as an organization that could compete with the Knights of Labor. But I don't know. That might have just been somebody's surmise because the name sounded so.
I would rephrase that into, it may have been one or two people said that. I would rephrase that. The Knights of Labor, Knights of Columbus, the Freemasons, the Knights of Pythias, all of the fraternal organizations were similar reactions to an industrializing society in deep chaos, an attempt to gain male fraternal bonds in a society of deep chaos and industrialization. Okay. All right. As far as Powderly goes, let's start with him. He was a child of industrial America. He was in fact born in Carbondale, right nearby. This is a church he may have attended as a youth. I can't ascertain that for sure. St. Rose Catholic Church in Carbondale. He was the 11th of 12 children, huge family, born to immigrant Irish parents in 1849, right nearby. At the time, Carbondale was grimy and poor, and the anthracite industry there was dying and moving further out towards Scranton. He himself was scrawny, sickly, not your typical working class hero that you might envision at the time. He had lost his hearing in one ear as a result of scarlet fever. And he had a variety of throat and respiratory ailments, so he was sick a lot as a young man. And he was the target of local bullies, which maybe perhaps caused him to focus a little bit more on reading and books. His brothers liked to read. His mother was an abolitionist, so she was against slavery, which wasn't that uncommon in the North, but it took a certain tenderness of temperament. And he learned a lot of his tolerance and sympathy from his mother. His father had been a mine worker and then had been a superintendent of the mines. And later he became a skilled mechanic. Now Terence himself was witty, charming, very good debater. His education was cut short, which was very common at the time. Working class folks tended to go to school until maybe age 13 or so, leave school and then go to work to supplement the family income. You probably know that was very common at the time. So he attended school until he was 13. Then went to work at a coal, canal, and railroad firm called D&H, Delaware and Hudson Coal Company, where he served as a switch tender, a car examiner, a car repairer, a brakeman, a jack of all trades, essentially. And despite his bookish nature, he really enjoyed this work. He enjoyed working on engines and machines. He was very into that. So he was kind of a Renaissance man in the late 19th century, if you will. After he had an apprenticeship as a mechanic, and he came to Scranton, where things were booming, and started working at a locomotive shop. And though he had ambitions to be a novelist or a poet, which he eventually did write nonfiction, he embraced his mechanics work wholeheartedly. Now, just to give you some idea of the change, the demographic change going on between Carbondale and Scranton in the late 19th century. Carbondale was declining as a town, and Scranton was just growing enormously. Between 1850 and 1870, Scranton jumped from 1,000 people to 35,000 people. And a lot of this has to do with the arrival of the Scranton brothers. Colonel William Scranton comes to the city with his brother. And what they do is they establish the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, maybe you've heard of it, called the LIC in the 1840s. And what they were doing was building rails for the Erie Railroad, okay? And they eventually built the DLW Railroad a decade later, 1850 or so, to provide a venue of traffic between New York City and Scranton, okay? So they make the most of their location and the expansion of the whole region. Now the Scranton clan retains dominance in this area for decades. Terence Powderly serves as a mechanic with a guy named James Dixon of Dixon City. Perhaps you've heard of Dixon City. And James Dixon knows William King Scranton, a descendant of the Scranton family. And he asks William King Scranton for a job. William King Scranton gives him a job. So, yes.
Incidentally, if you look out the other window, you can see Scranton's castle with the big wall. We walked past that wall to get to the hotel. It's a very fortified mansion.
And you know why, yeah. So he goes to work for him. So this is just a little background on Powderly. Now, in the meantime, while all of this is going on, here's expanding a postcard from Scranton, late 19th century. Washington Avenue looking north. Okay? Then, in the meantime, while Powderly is embarking on his career as a mechanic, the Knights of Labor forms, and this is in 1869. And as Dan was saying, it was formed by a group of garment cutters from Philadelphia, who were all not just Masons, but Uriah Stevens, who was the head of this group. He's pictured in the middle. He's dead by this time, so they just have this kind of creepy. Have his picture in the middle. Uriah Stevens was a member of the Knights of Pythias and the Freemasons. And what they do is they work a lot of the rituals from the Masons into this new order, the Knights of Labor. And they're merely replaced, so they're a kind of union fraternal order at the same time. Okay? So they form in 1869, but it's really under power. So Uriah Stevens is head of the Knights of Labor until 1879. He dies. Terence Powderly, you know, he's working up in Scranton. He's the mayor of Scranton at this point. He becomes mayor in 1878. He then becomes the Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor. So the union grows immensely under Powderly. And I'm not saying George has nothing to do with it.
Oh, you know what?
Certainly not to this crowd.
It's not everything.
Just not everything. Well, it has to do with actually just labor's just in a terrible bind at the time. You know, there's strikes going on. The 1877 railroad strike that some of you may be familiar with. Knights of Labor membership skyrocketed because these people needed a way to organize themselves. Yes?
So Powderly was mayor before he was 30.
Yeah, he was young.
He repeat
He was mayor before
Was he mayor before he was 30? Remarking on how young Powderly was to come to this position of power. Yes. Under Powderly, this union will grow, as Dan had pointed out, to about over 700,000 members. Some say 1 million. I would say closer to maybe 725,000. But it's huge. I would also say at the time, strikes were not something that were popularly embraced by the labor movement. They would be in the early 20th century, but in the late 19th century, strikes were seen as counterproductive. Mostly what was embraced were arbitration and boycotts. Yet, it was in the midst of massive strikes in 1877, as I said, that the Knights of Labor membership skyrocketed. So these people Powderly himself would go around and say he was against labor strikes, but that was really how his union grew at the time. It was seen as immoral and socialistic at the time, okay? So, Knights of Labor, most powerful labor union of the 1880s that was seen in America, and it arises amidst this industrial change at the time. Why were the Knights unique? Why were they special? Why did they get so many members? Well, first of all, they were organized vertically as opposed to horizontally. Are you guys familiar with this term? Okay, vertical organization, they would organize by trade. Horizontal means that they organize across trades. So you would have coal breakers and coal miners, and all members of the coal industry organizing together, right? They may be separated into groups, but they would coordinate their activities together. So this horizontal organization tended to be more inclusive than the previous vertical organization, where people would stay more atomized into groups, right?
They're vertical now. I mean, the modern labor movement.
Samuel Gompers. Well, there's reasons that it's like that. Well, we do actually, well, we won't go into the whole service workers
I
thing.
can talk to that.
You want to say something about it?
Well,
Go ahead.
We've been studying, basically Gompers was Gompers several times, there was so much bickering between the Georgists and the Socialists that although Gompers was totally with George on the land question, which he considered the important question, and he frequently rejected socialism. He said the labor movement will not really become successful until we drop these ideological borders, confrontations, and just say that we are for trade unionism, period. And so he kind of pocketed the debate and said trade unionists are just for trade unionists, and the socialists who wanted a socialist system and the Georgists who wanted a Georgia system were cut out by somebody who said we're tired of arguing about it.
Any other comments on that? So this horizontal integration was very important in creating this new union and creating its power. Also, it gathered, by implication this would be the case, skilled and unskilled workers. You know how unusual that is, and that would change after the rise of the AFL in the late 19th century with Gompers, etc. But the Knights of Labor invited skilled and unskilled workers to be part of one big union, right? This was also part of its success at the time. Also, the Knights of Labor included previously marginalized groups. And this is limited, but they invited women. Here are some women delegates from 1886 from the Richmond Convention. And I love this picture because there's a baby in the middle. So they're not just trying to act like the men, they're embracing their femininity too and bringing the baby into
Well, the men were surrounding the dead past of their fallen leader. And the women were surrounding
Women should have risen up. So they invited women. Women were generally, in larger cities, segregated from men as far as their assemblies. But I found some pictures in our Powder League prints, we have lots of images related to this, of a local assembly in Ohio where the men and women were in a single assembly, which is really remarkable when you're talking about like 1888 and 1890. So they even had some mixed gender assemblies, local assemblies, meaning the local representation of the union. So women were invited. More remarkably, African Americans were also invited to be members. So you also had African American assemblies of the Knights of Labor. Yes, they were segregated, but they were invited to participate, and they did participate in union activities. Excluded were individuals. I'd like to know what you guys think about this, actually. The Knights deemed non-producers. Bankers and lawyers. People viewed as exploitative and as not contributing to the production of finished material goods. No, their constitution said these people cannot be part of the Knights of Labor because they're not producing anything. I mean, can you apply this today? I mean,
Yes.
that's in the constitution for the Knights of Labor.
I'm wondering if it was before or after they got Untitled Henry George.
Before. And after.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how you actually work that concept into a union that you'd have.
Well, usually they don't have bankers who need to do it. But anyway,
Bankers don't need
they don't
unions.
join unions.
But the idea of producing, well, today you could be exploited and not produce a finished product in the sense that you're actually creating an object. They really saw this in terms of creating an object.
But with coal mining, you're not creating, you're taking something out, you're not
It
saying.
was
Yeah.
loose off.
But I think they.
Exactly. No, they meant producing, there would be a finished good at the end of the tunnel. That's service workers generally, how would they incorporate them into this scheme? No, I know, it kind of boggles your mind. But at the time, it seemed to make a lot of sense because we were in an industrial, not a post-industrial economy, as we are now. Yeah.
But at that time, they would have had lots of maids and housekeepers
Yeah.
and also, so did they exclude them? Do you have any record of?
There probably wasn't a maids union. Usually the assemblies were connected to the industrial economy, so they would have female factory workers, but I haven't seen any local of maids, you know. I don't know, it's an interesting thing to find, yeah.
I don't know if it would influence in the United States, but Rudolf Steiner was writing around that same time in Europe. And he specifically referred to
Yeah.
producers
Yeah,
and non-producers. It was
Right.
his work in the threefold commonwealth. And so it's possible, that distinction was being made by him and then imported to American thinking.
yeah, that's interesting. Wait, give me his name later.
Rudolf Steiner.
Steiner, okay, yeah, I'll have to
Boston.
look into that. No, that's interesting. And, these people were very well read. It's possible that they could have been applying his theories over here. Yeah.
Sort of related to that, and it comes to mind issues of ex-European socialist activists, many of whom rose to become leaders of the labor trade union movement in the United States. And I wonder in this part of the country to what extent they had any influence and how their native ethnicity played a role in organizing the Irish versus the German versus the Italians, the Poles, etc. Was there, in your research, do you see any of that evidence where they gravitated to one another, or there was power struggles because of their
By ethnic group?
their ethnicity and perhaps the earlier European experiences?
Okay, that's a lot of good questions in that comment.
I can choose one.
Well, I would say 1886, right? 1886, you don't really have as many Italians yet as you're going to later. You don't really have as many Slavs. And that's the real division is going to come after like 1890 when you have the Eastern and Southern Europeans, the Mediterraneans and the Eastern Europeans coming over. Not that there were not divisions between Germans and Irish, but mostly you're going to have Germans, Irish. You also have a large Protestant population, Protestant ethnic population in the U.S., British, that sort of background. And I think they managed to find common ground, but there was lots of ethnic infighting nonetheless. And as I'll show you, there is among the church too, which is dominated by the Irish.
Henry George's third article in that book, Labor in Pennsylvania, talks about how the Irish very much disliking the Eastern Europeans because the Eastern Europeans were much more willing to do whatever the coal workers wanted, and that this very much changed after the Connellsville coke and coal strike, when the Irish tried to organize the strike. They didn't bring the Eastern Europeans in on it because they were still in the planning phase. The Eastern Europeans heard about it and went out on strike, and actually became the dominant leading factor of the strike. When the strike was over, when they got an agreement, the Irish wanted to go back to work, and the Hungarians said, there are people who've been jailed over this strike. Nobody goes back to work until everybody's out of jail. And it turned out from that point on that the Eastern Europeans were just as strong in the labor organization as the Irish were, and the relationships between them improved tremendously. So.
Also, I just thought of this letter in the Powderly collection. There's a letter to Powderly from a priest in Maryland, and the priest is talking about how the different ethnic groups are attracted to the Union nonetheless. But their local priests have different effects on the population. Like, I think it was Eastern European priests were telling their workers not to join, whereas the German priests were telling them that it was okay. So there was that kind of relationship too. The other thing that points to this question really in a great way, unfortunately, is that the Knights of Labor excluded Chinese. They were also against Chinese immigration and supported the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So that says there were certain limits on their inclusiveness also. So there was this anti-Chinese sentiment also, yeah.
In terms of Ed's question about the ethnic issues, I can't remember his name, but the Chicago priest, sociologist, novelist, who am I speaking about? Andrew Greeley. Andrew Greeley's studies have indicated a clear problem among the Irish themselves. He refers to the lace curtain Irish linked with the London aristocracy, wanting to be more English than Irish, who also were the ones that stopped the freedom of Ireland.
Right.
And what they were called the Shanty Irish, who Tweed controlled the workers, the working Irish. And so therefore the Catholic Church was led by lace curtain Irish, for all intents and purposes. And that pattern continued, especially when the Germans came, because the Germans were not as, English as the English, and horribly treated the Italians, which I'm a member of, and especially the Sicilians.
This might just be a synonym for lace curtain Irish, but Archbishop Corrigan, who got McGlynn canned, was referred to as a castle Catholic.
That's the one. That's it.
But McGlynn came from a fairly stable family also. Cardinal Gibbons came from a poorer family, and he supported the workers. But I love that distinction. Thank you for pointing that out. There were quote, lace curtain and chantier. The lace curtain Irish, of course, wouldn't join the Knights of Labor. Mostly wouldn't lead it either. So thank you for that. That's another good point. So there are lots of ethnic divisions going on here. That's a great question. We could go on for like an hour just about that.
Dan will, if you give me a chance.
Just to straighten things out with you guys, she had asked me to co-present with her, and I said, you have more fresh information, so you do most of the talking. But
So they did support the Chinese exclusion of 1882 on the grounds that it would prevent outside competition. So I would add that. Nonetheless, to give you some idea, their general numbers, between 1869 and 1896, the order could be found in every state. Okay, so every state had some assembly of the Knights of Labor, and there were 15,000 local assemblies. So this idea really had resonance. Now, as far as, I thought I'd say a word about Powderly's term as the mayor of Scranton. As Dan pointed out, he was elected in 1878 as a member of the Greenback Labor Party, and he served 3 two-year terms. As mayor, like you were talking about, like what was he able to do, actually? Well, he had lots of plans. He was into municipally owned gas and water works. He wanted to make a cooperative boot and shoe factory. He also wanted to restructure the city's tax structure, partly along the ideas of Henry George, but the city council wouldn't let him do any of it. So he really got very little passed as far as these reforms are going, these progressive reforms go, because of the city council, unfortunately for him. But he was really popular, both as mayor and as the head of the Knights. And just to give you some idea of how popular this guy was, there were people that named their baby after him. This did not just happen once. William Mullen, a Knights leader and organizer in Richmond, Virginia, named his son Terence Powderly Mullen in 1885. This is Terence V. Powderly, they even kept the initial, Powderly Peterson from Kansas. So people named their babies after him. That's how popular he was. He was like a rock star, practically. He was greeted with cheers and celebrations. Just a quote, a Nashville, Tennessee furniture worker admiringly wrote, quote, "I have never seen or heard you but once, but I fell in love with you with a love that will burn till I die," unquote. And this could seem kind of corny or excessive to us. We've just transferred all of this over to celebrities. It's kind of the same. He was a celebrity at the time, and at least he was doing something more productive than making trashy movies. But that's just my personal commentary. But more substantially, John Coggeshall, a knight in Iowa, wondered in 1882, and he wrote a letter to Powderly. He said, "Would we ever get relief from the state of slavery to which the Vanderbilts, Goulds, Garretts, Perkins, and other corporation magnates have reduced us, owing to our hitherto isolated and consequently defenseless position?" So this was part of the language at the time, right? Part of the language of the Knights of Labor at the time. Okay, so what's the problem with the Catholic Church and the Knights of Labor? Let's get the Catholic Church involved in here. So you think, what would they be complaining about? What would be so terrible about these Knights of Labor? They seem to be doing a good thing. First, this is another sign of his popularity. This is from Puck also. I just threw this in for fun. An American autocrat. This shows you that he upset the powers that be with his position. It says orders to strike, tied up, that's a train station, tied up by order of T.B. Powderly. And the best is the top. It says, the button to request assistance from the Knights of Labor. So he would just hit a button, and on the bottom it says he ties up railroads and exposes the public to inconvenience and danger whenever he's obliged to do something for his salary. So he just sat around and hit a button when he needed more money, and it says salary $5,000 a year. So another pup commercial or cartoon. Sorry. Just
Commercial's right.
yeah, right. It's just anachronistic, I guess. Picking slate in Scranton, some coal miners in Scranton. I thought you might want to see.
Can you back that up?
Yes. Actually, this gets to what I'm going to talk about right now. The Catholic Church. So the leaders of the Catholic Church have trouble with the Knights of Labor. Why? Number one is socialism. The church fears socialism for the obvious reasons. It's in its purest form an anti-religious body of ideas, or at least a non-religious body of ideas. And the 19th century saw the birth of socialism, and impoverished workers everywhere embraced it because it sought to restructure society. And the church favored this. And the Knights favored a redistribution of wealth. They favored the 8-hour workday. They favored cooperative workplaces where workers made decisions with their employers. And the church saw this as attempting to redistribute income. It's a stretch, but whatever. Second, violence. The church feared labor violence. You had referred to the Mcguires. Well, of course, the Mcguires were about more than just violence. But recall, just a few years before the rise of the Knights, you had these murders conducted by the labor agitators, the Mcguires, which were based here, by the way, in this region. And they had operated in the coal fields and used violence to achieve fair treatment of workers. And this turned church leaders off to labor organizing because everybody seemed to be a Mali. And by the way, Terence Powderly was referred to a Mali in many cases, and he really did not like it. He was very much afraid of anarchy, very critical of anarchists, which I'll get into more in just a minute. Finally, the Knights engaged in secrecy. Right? Now, why would they engage in secrecy?
Their tactics were being revealed.
Say that again?
Their tactics were being revealed.
Yeah, well, precisely. The church takes this personally. The church is like, you're engaging in all this secret behavior. And I put this here to illustrate that. The Adelphon Fructos was the secret ritual booklet. That's just the front page of the Knights of Labor. We have several copies of it. It's very fascinating reading, and it just goes through different rituals that the Knights went through as part of their initiation rite. And the Adelphon Fructos, various church leaders got copies of this, and they thought, oh gosh, they're engaging in Freemasonry. And a lot of the rites were actually based on Freemason rites, so that was even more antagonistic to the church. The Freemasons had been outlawed in 1734 because they were antagonistic to the church. So church leaders would variously accuse the Knights of Freemasonry and the penalty was, if you were a Knight of Labor and you were engaging in this activity, you would not receive the sacraments. That's how they twisted their arms. So what happens? How does this situation come to a head? In Canada, it's 1884, a very conservative archbishop. He's the Archbishop of Quebec. His name is Elazar Tascaro. And he invokes the ban on secret societies to condemn the Knights organizing in Quebec, because they're industrializing also. The idea becomes popular, moves south into the United States, and Bishop James Healy of Maine publishes the ban and says he won't give sacraments to any Knights in his archdiocese either, So you see where this is going here. Various Catholic leaders get wind of this information. They're trying to decide, should we condemn the Knights too? And people start talking about this whole situation. And you're either going to have Catholics joining the Knights and leaving the church, or Catholics leaving, Catholic workers are going to ignore the ban and exit the church, or they're going to heed the ban and not join the Knights. So what happens is, James Gibbons of Baltimore, who I've just discussed briefly, what he does is he takes the position that if we condemn the Knights, we're going to lose the workers of the church. And I think he's probably right about this. So,
We have 30 minutes.
I have 30 minutes? Okay. No problem. So he's very shrewd in dealing with power. He attempts to spread this position around. And he starts talking to other Catholic leaders about this whole issue. And he believes that the church is going to lose members and revenue if the Knights of Labor are condemned. So he and several other Catholic labor leaders, do two things to support their view that Catholics should not be forbidden to join the Knights. First, they convinced Terence Powderly to end the policy of secrecy in the Knights of Labor. Specifically, not undertaking this oath that looks like it contradicts fidelity to the church. And Powderly gets that done. And he marginalizes the Adelphine Cruptos, the secret brotherhood, and says, we're not going to do so much of that. We're going to do a little ritual, but let's downplay that. The second thing he does is he writes something called a memorial, which this is in 1887. And a memorial is a petition. Gibbons writes this. Gibbons writes a memorial, petition to the Pope, asking him to not condemn the Knights of Labor. It's a very long piece. We have pieces of it online on our website. Very interesting. And he says, essentially, this is a huge mistake. There's no socialism in the Knights of Labor. They're not doing anything wrong. Workers are tremendously oppressed. The Pope, you need to say something about this situation. And don't condemn them. And Rome issues a decision in 1888, and it's not a ringing endorsement of the Knights of Labor, but they don't condemn the order in the United States. So Catholics are permitted to join the Knights of Labor and remain Catholics in good standing. That's the upshot. Thanks to Cardinal Gibbons. Yes?
George, after wearing the baron, George wrote an open letter to Leo.
Yeah.
And Leo also wrote an encyclical against Freemasonry. Why didn't George use the same tact and write a memorandum?
Brown Novar?
No. Well, he wrote an open letter to Leo. Why wasn't there a letter like you just mentioned?
By Gibbons?
No, by the Knights of Labor. You said
Oh, why didn't Powderly write the letter?
Powderly wrote a letter to the Vatican, to the Pope, correct?
No.
Gibbons.
Gibbons wrote it.
Oh, Gibbons wrote it.
I wasn't clear about that. That was I didn't say that clearly enough. Actually, Gibbons wrote the letter.
I found out we only have 10 minutes because the dining room has to set up in here.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go to the other room. They're down, they're preparing to pick up the slideshow. If she wants to talk while that's going on, we can go just as long as we can until lunch is ready.
Okay, so we might be able to continue in the other room, but we have to, they said there's a computer, we have to do the logistics of getting your PowerPoint booted and up to where you are.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's looking.
Let's keep the comments to zero and
Let's get through the PowerPoint and then we'll pause.
Okay.
Got about 10 minutes.
All right, let me tell you about Powderly's interesting relationship with Henry George, because this is something people here don't know about so much. A little bit? Okay. And I have some quotes from some letters here, but I do have the Mcglynn stuff that it would be nice to come on. Let's see how far we can go. Okay. Powderly, as you all probably know, he read George's works. He read Progress and Poverty, and he followed George's works. In fact, in 1883, he told the Knights of Labor to read George, that George has some good ideas. Knights of Labor reading rooms were stocked with George's works. So there was very much a strong relationship there between these two men and between the order and George. In fact, as you probably know also, George was a Knight of Labor. He was a member of a local in New York, and he joined in 1880. So they were simpatico on a lot of things. Also, we were talking about the Irish here. They were both, as McGlynn also, were members of the Irish Land League, right? Are you guys familiar with Irish Land League? Against landlordism in Ireland. And this was headed by Michael David and various other figures, Irish figures, and they would come to the United States and try and raise awareness of the United States of the exploitation of Irish peasants by the British in Ireland. So Henry George and Terence Powderly, both very much strong supporters of getting rid of Irish landlordism, Irish peasants owning the land. So they had that in common too. But they did have a lot of differences that eventually caused them to grow apart considerably. Oops, there's George. The Haymarket affair, there's your man. That's in our Powderly collection, yeah, we have that in our archives actually. It's a nice picture, I know it's not like...
You got the wrong picture. We'll do some comparisons later.
Let's go. All right, we actually have one of him when he was older too. Anyway, let's see. Oh, Haymarket, 1886, the Haymarket affair. Everybody's familiar with this particular affair. All right. Well, George and Powderly begin to differ here in very clear ways. Powderly is against clemency for the people accused of committing the murders at Haymarket. Okay? And as you probably know, George, at least initially, is for clemency, right? No execution for the people accused. And of course, there's all kinds of evidence that shows that the people that were accused of this and the ones that hung, we're not really sure if they actually did this. So, you know, this is a terrible moment in the labor movement, this Haymarket affair, and it raises all kinds of bells for the American public. Oh my gosh, these people are anarchists, they're going to take over our country. So, this rift between these two guys becomes very public. Powderly's he doesn't like anarchism. He thinks these people should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And they come out publicly in these positions. And the rift between them begins to develop. They also differed, as you mentioned, Dan, on their trade beliefs. They fought, I have several letters, I have copies of these too if you guys want to see them, where George writes to Powderly trying to convince him to abandon his protectionism. He thinks it's just ridiculous, this protectionism. But at least half of the knights were protectionists. And this may be a limited way of looking at maintaining your job, but this is what they thought at the time. And of course, George was a free trader. I'll just give you a little clip from a letter that that George wrote to Powderly in 1889 that I think is kind of funny. He's trying to convince him to embrace this, to abandon his protectionism. He says to Powderly, "If you waste your strength pottering about little trifling go-nowhere matters, without one clear ringing note on the grand essentials, your day will soon have passed. But if you, he already had his day, it's hard. But if you throw aside your protectionism and all the quack remedies that have been the stock in trade of the conventional labor leaders who have succeeded each other only to disappear, and plant yourself firmly and unequivocally on the broad platform of equal rights and equal justice, urging the only practical measures by which they can be attained, you have before you not merely a great work in the present, but a high place in the list of those who have helped onward the cause of freedom." So Powderly gets this letter, and he has his assistant stamp on the top, "No answer required." So you know what he thought of George's views at this point. And they did reconcile a bit later, but this really was a serious rift between the two men. So I would start with Edward McGlynn now, but if we can't keep the going. I'll do whatever you guys. So someone makes you leave? Yeah. Okay.
Dan, why don't you tell the kids, let them, all they're going to do is fill up the buffet table.
No, they're going to change the table. If you want to go talk to them about it while we continue, go ahead.
All right. All right, we'll wait till they kick me out. Okay. So you have the point too. You're starting to have these clear policy disagreements between all these members of the labor movement by the 1880s. And it's in this context that Edward McGlynn enters the picture. And this is such a colorful story. I think they should make a movie about McGlynn. Somebody's telling me about a play that was made about him. I think they should make a movie. And there should be a movie about this guy because he's so interesting. So, most of you are familiar with him, but basic details. He's one of 11 children, born to Peter and Sarah McGlynn. His father had considerable wealth, but he died early. But he had a pretty comfortable life early on. He went to Rome at the age of 13 to study at the Urban College of the Propaganda of the Faith, which is a very scary title, I know. But at the time, propaganda didn't have the connotations that it does now, which maybe it should have. So he was training to do missionary work and related activities. He's tall, he's eloquent, he's handsome, he's a brilliant student, and he's very young. They give him a teaching post at what's known as the North American College at Rome. And the North American College was established to train American priests. So he's there for a year. Then he's sent to New York City, to a parish in New York City in 1860 from Rome. By 1865, he is the head of the largest parish in New York City, St. Stephen's Parish, very famous parish, 25,000 people, or souls registered, very large parish. So he's very influential is the point here. So right from the bat, he's becomes controversial. Now when parishes are built, the common practice and the advised practice is that you build the church and then you build a parish school connected to it, right? That was a way to combat anti-Catholicism, because in the public schools, Catholic kids often encountered anti-Catholic prejudice. But it was also a way of consolidating power within the church. Build a school, send all the Catholic kids to school, you've got parishioners for life. Well, McGlynn comes along, he says, I was educated in the public schools. I think we should just send all the kids to the public schools. Let's use the money for charity. Let's use the money for charity, and let's use it for religious instruction. He says this publicly, it gets in the newspapers, and he gets into trouble. That's where he starts getting into trouble. So even before George came around and consolidated his relationship with McGlynn, he's in trouble. Now, he's also into the Irish Landleaguers, and he actually goes and speaks on behalf of the Irish Landleaguers in the United States, in New York. And he was not supposed to do this, but he did it anyway. And at one point in 1882, he speaks at a meeting, a very large meeting for the Landleaguers, and he espouses the ideas of Henry George, who he's read and loves his ideas. So he espouses the ideas of Henry George, says we should apply George's ideas in Ireland, then says, hey, let's apply his ideas in the United States too. And so he says this publicly, it's published, and Roman officials get very upset. They hear the story, and they say, this guy has to be silenced. And the Roman official, Cardinal Giovanni Simeoni, tells McGlynn's superior, Cardinal McCloskey, Corrigan's not there yet, you need to shut this guy up. So McCloskey goes and talks to McGlynn, says stop. And McGlynn says, okay, I will not make any more public statements on this matter. I promise you, to McCloskey. Well, he thinks this promise only lasts until McCloskey's death, which is 3 years later. So McCloskey dies, and Archbishop Corrigan takes his place, the one he has this huge fight with, and McGlynn says, well, you know what, my promise is ended because McCloskey's dead, and now I can say anything I want. And he starts publicly speaking on behalf of George again. So he starts this public speaking, and this is the situation when Henry George runs for mayor in 1886. And McGlynn goes on this whirlwind speaking tour in support of George. Meanwhile, Corrigan, who's very conservative and angry, less discreet than McCloskey was, keeps telling him, you've got to stop doing this. And around this time, Corrigan also releases a letter condemning George's theories that's published in the papers. Now you see this war developing between Corrigan and his priest, McGlynn. And this is all being aired in the press. So the letter is sent also to Cardinal James Gibbons. Cardinal James Gibbons says, as the Dean of the American Church, I'm going to have to do something about this. I got 2 of my guys fighting with each other in public. Rome is not happy. Remember what I said in the beginning? They don't want people to see what's going on within the church. Am I going too fast? I'm going fast, but... Okay.
We're timing it because they're setting up quietly.
Okay.
Richard succeeded.
Okay, good. Because I think I can wrap this up soon. Gibbons says, as a senior member of the hierarchy, I need to go and do something about this. The relationship between McGlynn and Corrigan continues to sour. McGlynn is being more outspoken than ever. And Gibbons goes and makes a visit to New York right before he goes to Rome to get his cardinal's hat. And he talks to McGlynn's friend, maybe you know him, Father Richard Bertzel. And Bertzel, because he doesn't want to talk directly to McGlynn. Why? Because it looks like he's violating Corrigan's position. Only Corrigan is supposed to discipline McGlynn, not Gibbons, directly. So he goes and talks to McGlynn's friend, Richard Bertzel. Bertzel says, you know, he's really not saying anything so bad. He's not a socialist. Henry George isn't a socialist either. Gibbons says, oh, you're right. Let me go to Rome and talk to the Pope when I go get my red hat and see what he says. So he does. And Leo XIII, the Pope at the time, asks him, what is going on in New York? And Gibbons says, I'm going to tell Edward McGlynn to come and talk to you personally. And around the same time, Gibbons is in Rome, talking to the Pope, trying to defend McGlynn, and to not do it in an obvious way to upset Corrigan in New York. Word comes to Gibbons that Henry George's works are going to be prohibited. They're going to be put on the index of prohibited books by the Catholic Church. And this causes lots of publicity if this does happen, if your book is prohibited. And Gibbons says, oh, you know, if this happens, that's going to be horrible because it's going to look like the Pope is violating American ideals of free speech, which of course it would. And it's probably going to get more people reading the stuff than would ordinarily, which of course he's right. So, and he knows also that there could be a nativist backlash against Catholics if this happens, if the Pope does this, because there's a lot of anti-papal sentiment in America. So he prepares another memorial, a petition to the Pope saying, please don't ban Henry George's books. And he says essentially that George's ideas originate with Herbert Spencer and John Stuart Mill anyway, and that the Pope would be judged harshly in the United States for attacking, quote, a humble American artisan, whose ideas are really based on somebody else anyway. That's his argument. And, you know, a lot of this has to do with politics, and Gibbons just trying to get his way. He's a very shrewd prelate. So he also says that he explains that Henry George isn't really a socialist, which I won't go into all the reasoning here because we don't have time.
We know why.
You know why. Finally, he says he thinks these ideas are going to die out anyway, just like the Knights of Labor will. And that you really shouldn't condemn it. And a lot of this is politics, because Gibbons really was a friend of the working man, but he says, you know, these ideas will decline anyway, so don't worry about it. So what ends up happening is the Pope reads the petition. He does condemn George's work, but he doesn't publish it. So it doesn't get the kind of attention that Gibbons thought it might.
It's on the secret index of books that we're not going to tell you you're not allowed to read.
That is so Rome, to do something halfway so that people are confused about what you're actually doing. Meanwhile, the situation with McGlynn grows worse. As you know, in 1887, he's asked to head the Anti-Poverty Society created by Henry George, right? Well, he then gives, as the head of the Anti-Poverty Society, McGlynn, his famous speech, The Cross of a New Crusade, where he, of course, supports George and the single tax theory. He gives this speech. And it's here that Terence Powderly now enters the picture. Edward McGlynn gives his speech. He's getting really popular. He wants to spread the word about the Anti-Poverty Society. He asks Terence Powderly for the mailing list for the Journal of United Labor. Okay? This is the publication of the Knights of Labor. Terence Powderly is in a bind here, right? He says, if I give him this list, I'm already in trouble with the Catholic Church, because this is around the same time. If I give him this list, I'm going to get in even more trouble. The hierarchy's going to get mad at me. Who knows, maybe then they'll condemn the Knights of Labor. So he tells McGlynn, no, I'm not giving it to you. McGlynn then goes and publicly denounces Powderly and the Knights of Labor. And there's a huge uproar in the press between McGlynn and Powderly. So they get into a huge fight.
And we thought we were contentious.
He also repeats, yes?
Can I ask, at the same time that this has happened, also another New York City priest, Father Isaac Hecker, right?
Oh, yeah.
He's getting in
Paul's.
trouble with the
Yes.
democracy movement. and he's condemned, essentially.
Shortly after,
And our arrest is Bronson.
are you talking about Brownson? Well,
Well,
Hector's,
both of them, they're together.
they're the head of this movement that was labeled Americanism,
Right.
which was about the church's adaptation to American circumstances, which the Rome sees as too democratic and too libertarian, right? So they do condemn it in a document called Testum Benevolente. Americanism is condemned. Yes, so that's going on as well. But that's more among the hierarchy. This involves a little bit more of the foot soldier group, right? And by the way, Cardinal Gibbons was definitely condemned in Testum Benevolente. He was an Americanist, quote, along with Hecker. But a whole other story, but good point. So McGlynn keeps giving his speeches, and he was ordered, as he's giving these speeches, look, stop giving speeches for George and his theories. In 40 days, you're going to be excommunicated. He keeps giving his speeches, and on July 3rd, 1887, he is excommunicated from the church. Corrigan fears that he might be reinstated back into the church if he goes and makes his case. So he passes information about McGlynn's apparent sexual activities and promiscuity, which I kind of think may have been fabricated, but we don't know for sure yet because all the records haven't been released. He sends these to Rome. No, he fabricated other documents against McGlynn too. No. No comment. So, exactly. So he sends this to Rome. The excommunication is affirmed. Corrigan actually, this is really weird, Corrigan actually makes membership in the Anti-Poverty Society a sin. So if you join the Anti-Poverty Society, you will not receive the sacraments. And in 1889, Teresa Kelly, a member of the Anti-Poverty Society, dies and is refused burial in New York for being a member. Okay, so 1892 rolls around, the excommunication is sticking, McGlynn doesn't care, he's going around and talking anyway. And the Leo XIII, who has just released Rerum Novarum, which is influenced by both the Knights of Labor and Henry George's work, says, I want you to go and reconcile McGlynn with the church. He releases an emissary. The emissary says to McGlynn, okay, say that you're for Rerum Novarum, outline your theories, and let's see if we can fix all this. McGlynn writes out his theories. The delegate that came to see him says, you know what, there's nothing socialist about this. You're reinstated. So he's reinstated in the church in 1892, and McGlynn embraces Rerum Novarum. But I want to end with this. Corrigan's not happy about any of this, of course. He's been sidelined. McGlynn is transferred to Newburgh, New York, to a parish in Newburgh, New York, where he continues to speak on behalf of the single tax theory. He gives his last great speech at the funeral of Henry George in 1897, saying, quote, there was a man sent from God, and his name was Henry George. And then he dies in 1900. Edward McGlynn does. Powderly's gone by 1924. Gibbons is gone by 1921. It's really the end of an era when these guys pass on. And you have the rise of the AFL-CIO after that. And that's, yeah, that's
good, and the lunch is served. If people want to stand up and stretch, that's fine. There'll be a dramatic reading of some things from the 1902 hearings? It was here. Yeah, it was the Great Coal Strike here in 1902. Teddy Roosevelt, the guy who ran against Henry George, but later started saying nice things about Henry George, called a special commission because the White House was cold. And there was no coal for the White House. So they called a special commission to study labor relations, and this play is about the hearings that occurred in Scranton and Philadelphia around that, with Clarence Darrow and other Georgists involved.
Courthouse. Probably, for some of you, you see the satellite dish there. It's directly to its left, directly to the left of the American flag. That's the Lackawanna County Courthouse. The hearings for the 1902 strike happened in that building, in courtroom number 3. And it happened 100 years ago in 2002, and we were commissioned, our company was commissioned to honor the strike because it is considered the greatest historical thing that ever happened in this area. Because out of that strike became the minimum wage, the 8-hour, 9-hour workday, the child labor laws, the collective bargaining between unions and the rules, and it affected the entire country. So it is truly considered the greatest event that ever happened in Scranton. Clarence Darrow came to Scranton to represent labor, and of course the coal barons. This was one of the wealthiest areas in the country. They were represented by 23 different attorneys because they each wanted to have their own say. But Wayne McVeigh, who was the Attorney General of the United States under President Garfield, he represented mostly the coal barons. The hearings for the miners happened in Scranton. They took place over a time period of about 2 weeks. Then the commission moved to Philadelphia, where the coal barons' testimonies were heard. Now, because it's a play, we had to take some liberties when we put the play together. Dan had it a little bit reversed. I wrote the play. That never happened. Thank you, Dan. I didn't notice that. But we wrote the play, and I say we, Jack McDonough, who lives in San Luis Obispo, California now, he also wrote The Fire Down Below, which is the book. They're both will be on sale in the lobby after this. But anyway, how it happened was Monsignor Quinn, earlier, Maria, you mentioned St. Rose in Carbondale. He's currently the pastor up there now. He's also a prominent clergyman in the region. And he came to me and said, you know, we need to honor the strike. It's the 100th anniversary. And so what happened was we developed this play, which Phil and I are about to read, and excerpts from it, which pertains to what you're all here for. And also we decided that what we couldn't cover in a play, we would cover in the book. So everybody who came to the Lackawanna County Courthouse, where we held the play, in the room where it happened, there were ghosts all over the place. It was really interesting. But everybody who bought a ticket also got this book. And now the book's still on the planet, and now it's part of the literary archives of the area. Then, and Phil is going to touch on this in just a little bit, the book Anthracite came out, which is one of the, I think, one of the most important literary works to come out of here, because it's the first time that plays about anthracite coal have ever been put together in a book. And Phil's going to explain after we read why we did that. Now, because it's a play, we were able to take some liberties. So, George Bear, who I'm going to read right now, Phil's going to take care of Wayne McVeigh and Clarence Darrow. George Bear made a summation for the mine owners in Philadelphia. But because you don't have a play unless you have conflict, we decided, as the authors of the play, to put him in Scranton at the beginning of the play so the conflict could be clearly established. And then we brought in what the miners had to say and things like that. So we did take some liberties. Later on, and Dan will explain, we also added a woman because we felt it was very important that the woman's perspective towards the anthracite strike be also taken care of in the play. So we're going to read a little excerpt from that also. George Bear was the president of the Reading Railroad. He was an extremely wealthy man, and to say arrogant, I'd have to say so, because he didn't look at it from any other point of view other than the cash. So the miners were deeply oppressed here. There was violence in the coal fields. John Mitchell was the champion of the coal miners. He's buried in Cathedral Cemetery, which is right over the hill, over here in West Scranton. His statue is on Courthouse Square, right in front of the courthouse. He was a hero. He's the only man in the history of this area who was laid out in the stake, and really the champion of the labor. So with that in mind,
We're going to take a listen for when Clarence Darrow speaks.